James Wilson stood in his front yard admiring his newly painted blue door. At 63, the retired postal worker took immense pride in his home. A modest but well-kept two-story house with a wraparound porch that he'd purchased 15 years ago. Located in the Oak Ridge subdivision of suburban Atlanta, it represented everything he'd worked for throughout his 40 years of dedicated service. The morning sun felt good on his face as he sipped coffee from his favorite mug, the one his son had brought him from naval training. Speaking of which, James smiled thinking about his boy. His son was coming home on leave this weekend, a rare treat these days with his demanding military schedule. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," called Mrs. Chen from next door as she collected her newspaper. "The door looks wonderful. That shade of blue really brightens things up." James waved back with a smile. "Thank you, Nancy." Thought it was time for a change. The Chens had moved in about 3 years ago and had been nothing but kind neighbors. Unlike some others in Oak Ridge who kept their distance from James, one of only 4 black homeowners in the predominantly white neighborhood, James wasn't naive about why some neighbors avoided eye contact at the community mailboxes, or why certain invitations never came his way. But he'd lived through much worse in his lifetime, and at this point in his life, he was content to focus on the good people around him, rather than those who couldn't see past skin color. Yesterday, he'd installed a small basketball hoop near his driveway. The neighborhood kids needed somewhere to play, and the community park was often occupied by older teens. His grandson loved basketball too, and James wanted to have something fun ready for his next visit. As James watered his petunias, he noticed Gerald Thompson from across the street watching him with a frown. Gerald was on the Homeowners Association board, a fact he mentioned at every possible opportunity. James simply waved, but Gerald just turned and walked back inside. What James didn't know was that his blue door and basketball hoop had become topics of heated discussion in certain circles of the neighborhood. The HOA had strict regulations about exterior modifications, requiring approval for everything from paint colors to landscape changes. But here was the thing. James's home predated the HOA's formation by 7 years. When the association was established, his property had been grandfathered in, meaning he wasn't actually subject to their rules. This technical detail was something Gerald Thompson and several other board members conveniently forgot whenever James made changes to his property. Later that afternoon, James was trimming his hedges when he overheard a conversation from the Thompsons' open window. "It's getting out of hand, Pat," Gerald was saying to someone. "First that gaudy blue door and now a basketball hoop. You know what kind of element that's going to attract?" James pretended not to hear, though the words stung. The element Gerald feared was clearly young black kids from the neighboring community. James had heard these coded concerns before. "The rules are clear," continued another voice that James recognized as Patrick Denton, another HOA board member. "We need to address violations promptly, before others think they can just do whatever they want." "Wilson's property is grandfathered in," said a woman's voice. Probably Gerald's wife, Linda. "We've been over this before." "Technicalities," scoffed Patrick. "Most people don't know their rights. A little pressure usually does the trick." James quietly moved away from the hedge, not wanting to hear more. Over his years in Oak Ridge, he'd witnessed how the HOA wielded its power selectively. Some violations, like the Andersons' oversized gazebo or the Millers' non-regulation mailbox, were overlooked entirely. Others were enforced with zealous dedication, especially when the homeowners didn't fit the neighborhood's preferred profile. Inside his home, James placed his garden shears in the kitchen drawer and glanced at the family photos on his refrigerator. His late wife, Diane, smiling from their vacation in New Orleans. His son in his Navy uniform standing tall and proud. His grandson blowing out birthday candles. This was what mattered, not the pettiness of neighbors who couldn't see beyond their prejudices. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Dad?" "It's me," came his son's deep voice. "Hey, just the man I was thinking about," James said, his mood instantly brightening. "You still coming tomorrow?" "Actually, that's why I'm calling. I managed to get away earlier than expected. I'll be there tonight around 8, if that works." "Tonight? That's wonderful news. I'll make your favorite, pot roast with those potatoes you like." "Sounds perfect. And Dad, I've got some big news to share." "Good news, I hope." "The best. I'll tell you all about it when I see you." "Love you, Dad." Love you too, son. Drive safe. James hung up, feeling a wave of happiness wash over him. His son had risen to lieutenant commander in the Navy, serving with distinction in a specialized unit. The military had been his passion since high school, and despite James's initial concerns about sending his only child into harm's way, he couldn't be prouder of the man his son had become. With renewed energy, James headed to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. As he drove through the neighborhood, he noticed Patrick Denton and Robert Mills huddled in conversation near the community center, both glancing his way as he passed. Robert was another self-appointed neighborhood watchdog who took HOA regulations more seriously than his actual job. At the store, James bumped into Layla Washington, another black homeowner from Oak Ridge who lived a few blocks over. "James, how are you?" She greeted him warmly. "I noticed your blue door yesterday when I was walking my dog. It looks fantastic." "Thanks, Layla. My son's coming home on leave tonight, so I've been sprucing things up." Layla's expression changed slightly. "That's wonderful about your son, but just so you know, I overheard some talk at the coffee shop this morning. Gerald and his buddies were discussing violations on your property." James sighed. "Let me guess, my door in the basketball hoop?" "Exactly. They were talking about some kind of enforcement visit. I'm not sure what that means, but thought you should know. I appreciate the heads up. Though my property's grandfathered in, they know that. Knowledge doesn't always stop people like Gerald when they think they're on a mission," Layla warned. "Just be careful." Back at home, James prepared dinner while pondering Layla's warning. Enforcement visit sounded ominous, but what could they really do? He had the original paperwork showing his exemption from HOA rules, stored safely in his home office. As evening approached, James set the table with his good dishes. His son rarely got home these days, and each visit was precious. The pot roast simmered in the slow cooker, filling the house with comforting aromas. Looking out his kitchen window, James noticed an unusual amount of activity at the Thompson house across the street. Gerald, Patrick, and Robert were standing in the driveway, seemingly in serious conversation. At one point, all three looked toward James's house. The sun was setting when James heard a car pull into his driveway. Expecting his son, he was surprised to see it was still too early for his arrival. Peering through the blinds, he didn't recognize the vehicle. His doorbell rang moments later. Taking a deep breath, James straightened his shirt and opened the door to find Gerald, Patrick, and Robert standing on his porch. All three wore khaki pants and matching navy blue polo shirts with HOA enforcement embroidered on the chest. Uniforms James had never seen before. Patrick even had what looked like a badge clipped to his belt. Though James knew for certain the HOA had no official enforcement officers, let alone badges. "Good evening, Mr. Wilson," Gerald said formally, clipboard in hand. "We're here on official HOA business regarding multiple violations on your property." James stood tall in his doorway, keenly aware that this visit wasn't about basketball hoops or blue doors. It was about something much older and uglier. But he wasn't about to be intimidated in his own home. What these men didn't know was that James Wilson wasn't alone tonight, and their plan was about to backfire in a way none of them could have anticipated. Gerald Thompson straightened his HOA enforcement polo shirt as he stood on James Wilson's porch. He had paid extra for the embroidery, believing it added an air of authority. Beside him, Patrick Denton fidgeted with the fake badge clipped to his belt, a sheriff's star purchased from a costume shop and modified with the words HOA enforcement etched around the edges. Robert Mills, the third member of their self-appointed committee, clutched a clipboard containing printouts of the HOA bylaws and violation forms they'd created themselves. None of these documents held any legal weight, but they'd discovered most residents didn't know that. "We've received multiple reports about unapproved modifications to your property," Gerald continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who believed deeply in his own importance. "The blue door and basketball hoop must be removed within 48 hours. James crossed his arms, leaning against his door frame. "Is that so?" The three men had begun their unofficial enforcement activities 6 months ago, after Gerald lost the election for HOA president to Diane Chen, Nancy's husband. The defeat had left Gerald bitter, especially since he'd run on a platform of maintaining neighborhood standards, a thinly veiled promise to make life difficult for homeowners who didn't fit his vision of an ideal Oak Ridge resident. The bylaws clearly state all exterior modifications require prior approval, Patrick added, tapping the clipboard Robert held. What none of them mentioned was how their little operation had begun. It started as griping sessions over beers in Gerald's garage, complaining about those people moving into Oak Ridge and bringing down property values. Their complaints had focused particularly on the handful of Black, Hispanic, and Asian families who had purchased homes in recent years. "We're just trying to maintain standards," was their common refrain, though they never seemed concerned when white homeowners bent the rules. After one particularly bitter session following Gerald's election loss, Patrick had jokingly suggested they form their own enforcement committee. The joke became reality after they successfully intimidated the Rodriguez family into removing their children's treehouse by showing up in matching polos with clipboards and stern faces. "We need to see your HOA approval forms for these modifications," Robert said, flipping through papers on his clipboard. "I don't have any," James replied calmly. Gerald smiled tightly, believing they'd caught him. "That's what we suspected. Violations like these can result in fines of up to $100 per day until corrected." What the trio didn't know was that earlier that week, James had visited the actual HOA office to confirm what he already knew. His property's grandfathered status exempted him from these regulations. The real HOA manager, Mrs. Foster, had even provided him with documentation reaffirming this fact. Their operation had been surprisingly effective over the past months. They'd successfully bullied the Patel family into repainting their too vibrant front door, forced the Williams family to remove their vegetable garden from the front yard, and pressured the Lopez family into taking down their holiday decorations ahead of schedule. Each success had emboldened them further. They'd even created fake violation notices on copy shop letterhead, which they'd leave on doorsteps or mail to residents. Most people, either too busy or too intimidated to question their authority, simply complied. Last week, during one of their planning sessions, Gerald had brought up James Wilson's property. "He's getting too comfortable," Gerald had said, nursing his third beer. "That blue door is just the beginning. Next thing you know, he'll have people hanging around at all hours playing basketball. My property values are already taking a hit with him living across the street," Patrick had added. "My realtor friend told me homes near, certain demographics sell for less." Robert, who harbored political ambitions for the real HOA board, saw an opportunity to prove his commitment to neighborhood standards. "We should pay him a visit," he'd suggested. "Full committee, official capacity." They'd spent an hour rehearsing their approach, anticipating resistance but confident in their intimidation tactics. They'd researched James online, learning he was a retired postal worker who, as far as they could tell, lived alone. A perfect target, an older man, probably on a fixed income who wouldn't want trouble. "The fines are just the beginning," Patrick now said on James's porch, warming to his role. "Continued violations can result in liens against your property." This was a complete fabrication. The actual HOA had no such power without going through proper legal channels, which required multiple notices, hearings, and board votes. But most residents didn't know the details of HOA law, and the trio counted on that ignorance. "We're just doing our job," Robert added with false sympathy. Rules are rules. The truth was they enjoyed these confrontations. There was power in watching people scramble to comply, in seeing the worry on their faces as they calculated potential fines they couldn't afford. It was a small kind of power, but for men who felt increasingly threatened by a changing world, a world where their automatic status no longer guaranteed them deference, it was intoxicating. What made their scheme particularly effective was how they operated just below the radar of the legitimate HOA. They never claimed to be the official board, just an enforcement committee. They never issued actual fines, just warnings about potential penalties. It was all suggestion and intimidation, carefully crafted to avoid outright fraud while achieving the same results. 2 days ago, they'd watched from Gerald's living room as James installed the basketball hoop. The sight had sent Gerald into a rant about the type of people who would be drawn to the neighborhood if such things were allowed. First, it's a basketball hoop. Then it's loud music, then who knows what else, he'd fumed. "We need to shut this down fast." They had chosen this evening deliberately, arriving just after dinner when most people were home and relaxed, not prepared for confrontation. They'd parked their car at the end of James's driveway, partially blocking it. Another small power play designed to establish dominance from the outset. "We'll need you to sign this notice acknowledging the violations," Robert said, extending a form toward James. James made no move to take it. "And if I don't?" The three exchanged glances. This wasn't the fearful compliance they'd expected. Most residents took the papers with shaking hands, eager to end the uncomfortable encounter. "Refusal to acknowledge violations is itself a violation," Patrick improvised, his hand moving to touch the fake badge at his belt. Gerald stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Wilson, we're trying to be reasonable here. Nobody wants this to escalate to the full board or legal action." The implied threat hung in the air. In truth, they had no authority to escalate anything, but most residents didn't call their bluff. The committee counted on people's natural aversion to conflict and their fear of authority, even fake authority presented with enough confidence what they couldn't know was that James Wilson had faced far more intimidating situations than three men in polo shirts playing make-believe. As a black postal worker in the 1970s and 80s, he'd encountered real discrimination and genuine threats. These three suburban weekend warriors with their costume shop badges didn't even register on his fear scale. "Let me make sure I understand," James said slowly. "You three are here representing the HOA to enforce violations regarding my door and basketball hoop?" "That's correct," Gerald said, relieved that James seemed to be accepting their authority. "And we'll need immediate action to remedy." "I'd like to see some identification," James interrupted. "Official HOA credentials." This was not part of the script. No one had ever asked for credentials before. "Our uniforms and badges are our credentials," Patrick said stiffly. James smiled slightly. "Anyone can buy a polo shirt and a toy badge." Gerald's face flushed red. "Now see here." "No, you see here," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I know exactly what you three are doing. It stops today, at least at my house." The trio's confidence wavered. This wasn't how these visits were supposed to go. "Furthermore," James continued, "I know my property is exempt from HOA regulations under the grandfather clause. I have the paperwork inside if you'd like to see it." Robert glanced nervously at his companions. This was unexpected. Most residents didn't know their rights or have documentation ready. Before any of them could respond, the sound of a car engine turning into the driveway made them all turn. Headlights illuminated the group as a dark SUV pulled up behind their blockade. The engine cut off and the driver's door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp navy uniform stepped out, his face set in an expression of professional curiosity as he surveyed the scene on his father's porch. "Everything okay here, Dad?" he called, his voice carrying the natural command of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The three enforcers froze, suddenly aware that their carefully constructed scenario was about to collapse entirely. Lieutenant Commander Anthony Wilson had been driving for nearly 6 hours, the familiar roads leading him home after months at sea. His Naval Special Warfare Unit had just completed a classified mission, and he'd been granted 3 weeks of leave, the longest break he'd had in years. The weight of responsibility temporarily lifted from his shoulders. He felt lighter with each mile that brought him closer to his father's house. Anthony checked his watch, 7:45 p.m. He was early, which would be a nice surprise for his dad. The familiar streets of Oak Ridge welcomed him, though he noticed several new developments since his last visit. His father had mentioned changes in the neighborhood during their phone calls, but he hadn't elaborated much. As he turned onto his father's street, Anthony immediately spotted the three men standing on the porch. Something about their posture, confrontational, intimidating, triggered his professional instincts. 15 years in the military had taught him to recognize a threat posture, and these men were definitely trying to project authority. He slowed the SUV, observing the scene. His father stood in the doorway, arms crossed. The three visitors wore matching polo shirts with something embroidered on them. One had what looked like a badge on his belt. Their car partially blocked his father's driveway, a deliberate move Anthony realized meant to establish dominance. Anthony pulled in behind their vehicle, effectively blocking them from leaving. If this was some kind of confrontation, he'd just changed the dynamics. He stepped out of his SUV, still wearing his dress uniform from the command ceremony he'd attended, before hitting the road. The crisp white of his officer's uniform reflected in the porch light as he approached. "Everything okay here, Dad?" he called out, his voice clear and steer. The three men turned, visibly startled by his presence. Anthony noted their reactions, the widening eyes, the subtle step backward from the one with the clipboard. His training had taught him to read people in high-pressure situations, and these men were definitely thrown off balance. "Just some neighborhood business, son," his father replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "These gentlemen from the HOA were just explaining some violations they believe I've committed." Anthony climbed the porch steps, standing beside his father. At 6'4", he towered over the three visitors. He extended his hand to the man who seemed to be the leader. "Lieutenant Commander Anthony Wilson, United States Navy," he said. "And you are?" Gerald Thompson took his hand reflexively, his grip weak and clammy. "Gerald Thompson, HOA Enforcement Committee." His voice had lost the authoritative tone it had carried just moments ago. "Patrick Denton," the second man said without offering his hand, his fingers now covering the badge at his belt. "Robert Mills," the third man muttered, clutching his clipboard like a shield. Anthony nodded professionally. "I see. And what seems to be the issue with my father's property?" The three exchanged glances, their well-rehearsed script suddenly inadequate. They had prepared for an elderly man living alone, not a military officer who radiated calm authority. "Unapproved modifications," Gerald finally said. "The blue door and the basketball hoop. All exterior changes require HOA approval." "Interesting," Anthony said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "May I see your identification, please?" Official HOA credentials. The same request his father had made, but coming from Anthony, with his commanding presence and uniform, it carried an unmistakable expectation of compliance. Our uniform," Patrick stammered. "Proper identification," Anthony clarified. "Badge numbers, HOA-issued ID cards, anything official." Earlier that day, the three men had met at Gerald's house to finalize their approach. They'd spent an hour role-playing the confrontation, anticipating resistance but confident in their ability to intimidate James Wilson. "He's just an old man," Gerald had said as he adjusted his polo shirt collar. "Probably living on Social Security. The threat of fines will be enough." Patrick had admired his modified toy badge in Gerald's hallway mirror. "We'll hit him with the violation notice first, then mention the daily fines. If he gives us trouble, we hint at liens on his property." "The key is to never let him gain confidence," Robert had added, reviewing his clipboard. "Keep him on the defensive. Don't give him time to think or question our authority." They'd rehearsed their lines, practicing stern expressions and authoritative stances. They'd even discussed how to position themselves on the porch, Gerald in front as the spokesman, Patrick and Robert flanking him to create an imposing presence. "Remember, quick in and out," Gerald had instructed. "Make the demands, get acknowledgement, leave before he can start asking questions." They'd chosen early evening deliberately, when people were typically relaxed and unprepared for confrontation. They'd timed previous enforcement visits the same way and found residents more compliant when caught off guard. What they hadn't prepared for was the arrival of James's son, a military officer who clearly understood intimidation tactics far better than they did. "We're a committee," Gerald now explained weakly. "We don't have individual credentials." Anthony's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened slightly. "I see. And does the HOA board know you're conducting these visits? Who appointed this committee?" None of the three men spoke. They hadn't anticipated being questioned about their authority so directly. "Let me understand," Anthony continued into the silence. "You've come to my father's home claiming official capacity, threatening fines and liens without any actual credentials or authority?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. "The bylaws clearly state—" "I'm familiar with HOA bylaws," Anthony interrupted calmly. "I'm also familiar with impersonation of officials, harassment, and intimidation tactics." The three men paled noticeably. "Furthermore," Anthony continued, "my father's property is exempt from HOA regulations under the grandfather clause, as I believe he already informed you." Inside the house, the timer for the pot roast beeped. James glanced over his shoulder, then back at the scene unfolding on his porch. "Why don't we all come inside?" he suggested, surprising everyone. "Dinner's ready and we can discuss this like neighbors." The invitation wasn't what any of them expected, not the three enforcers who had come to intimidate, nor Anthony, who had mentally prepared for a more confrontational resolution. Gerald looked at his companions uncertainly. We should probably be going. Actually, I insist, Anthony said pleasantly, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. We should clear this up properly. I'd like to understand exactly what authority you believe you're operating under. The three men found themselves following James into the house, Anthony bringing up the rear, effectively blocking any retreat. In the kitchen, the aroma of pot roast filled the air. James began pulling extra plates from the cabinet. Have a seat, gentlemen, he said, gesturing to the dining table. Awkwardly, they complied. The dynamic had shifted so dramatically that they seemed unable to formulate a strategic retreat. Anthony took off his uniform jacket, carefully hanging it over a chair. The insignia of his rank and the combat service ribbons were clearly visible, a silent testament to his authority that made their embroidered polo shirts seem childish in comparison. So, Anthony said as he sat down, tell me about this enforcement committee. When was it formed? Who authorized it? The three men exchanged nervous glances. The truth, that they'd invented the committee themselves, seemed impossible to admit under Anthony's steady gaze. It's more of an informal group, Gerald finally said, to help maintain standards. Informal, Anthony repeated, yet you present yourselves as officials with uniforms and badges. Patrick's hand instinctively moved to cover his toy badge again. That's interesting, Anthony continued, his voice conversational but his eyes intent. Because I spoke with Mrs. Foster at the HOA office this afternoon. This was a bluff. Anthony had just arrived, but the three men couldn't know that. Their expressions confirmed his suspicion. They were operating without any official knowledge or approval. James set plates of food in front of everyone. Eat up, he said kindly. No sense in letting good food go cold while we sort this out. The absurdity of the situation, the three fake enforcers now sitting awkwardly at their target's dinner table while his son calmly dismantled. Their scheme seemed to finally hit. Gerald. This has been a misunderstanding, he said, making no move toward the food. We should go. Before we've clarified the situation, Anthony asked, I'm particularly interested in how many other residents you've approached this way, with your unofficial committee. The implication was clear. This wasn't going to end with them simply walking away. Robert looked down at his plate, then back up at Anthony. We were just trying to maintain neighborhood standards, he said weakly. By intimidating select residents, Anthony's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. Interesting that you targeted my father's house specifically, and the Patels, and the Lopez family. They hadn't mentioned those names, which meant Anthony, or more likely his father, knew about their other enforcement visits. The basketball hoop is an eyesore, Patrick blurted out defensively. Property values have actually increased 12% in this neighborhood over the past year, Anthony finished for him. I checked the real estate listings on my drive-in. Seems Oak Ridge is doing quite well, basketball hoops notwithstanding. James took a seat at the head of the table. I've lived here 15 years, he said quietly. Longer than any of you. Never caused trouble. Keep my yard neat. Pay my dues, even though I'm exempt from many of the rules. The three men stared at their plates, unable to meet his eyes, so I have to wonder, James continued, what the real issue is with my blue door and a basketball hoop for the neighborhood kids. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. No one acknowledged it directly, but they all knew what James was suggesting, that this wasn't about property values or neighborhood standards. It was about who belonged in Oak Ridge and who didn't. Outside, another car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, they could see a woman in a business suit getting out, a folder tucked under her arm. The real HOA manager, Mrs. Foster, had arrived, and judging by her expression as she approached the house, she had some questions of her own for the self-appointed enforcement committee. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime cutting through the tense silence at the dinner table. James rose to answer it, leaving his son sitting across from the three increasingly uncomfortable men. Good evening, Mr. Wilson, came a woman's voice from the doorway. I apologize for disturbing you so late, but I received some concerning information today. Not at all, Mrs. Foster. Please come in, James replied. We were just having dinner. Would you care to join us? There's plenty. Oh, I wouldn't want to impose, Mrs. Foster began, then stopped abruptly as she entered the dining room and saw who was seated at the table. Her professional composure faltered for just a moment. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Denton, Mr. Mills, what a surprise to find you here. Eleanor Foster had served as the Oak Ridge HOA manager for 11 years. At 58, she ran the association with efficiency and fairness, having seen every kind of neighborhood dispute imaginable. Earlier that day, she'd received an email from the Lopez family with a photo of a violation notice left on their door. Regarding holiday decorations, a notice she hadn't authorized. It wasn't the first complaint she'd heard recently about unauthorized enforcement activities, but it was the first with photographic evidence. The notice had included the names of Gerald, Patrick, and Robert as HOA Enforcement Committee members, positions that didn't exist in the actual HOA structure. Concerned, she'd called an emergency meeting with the HOA board president, who confirmed no such committee had been authorized. They'd agreed to investigate immediately, starting with contacting the families who had received these notices. Her calls to the Patels and the Williams family had revealed a pattern of intimidation. When she couldn't reach James Wilson by phone, she decided to stop by his house on her way home. Finding the 3 unauthorized enforcers at his dinner table was the last thing she'd expected. "Mrs. Foster," Gerald said weakly. "We were just discussing some neighborhood concerns with Mr. Wilson." In matching uniforms with a fake badge, Anthony observed, gesturing to Patrick's belt. "Very official." Mrs. Foster's eyes narrowed as she spotted the toy badge. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand. Patrick hesitated, then unclipped the badge and handed it over. Mrs. Foster examined it carefully, her expression darkening. "This appears to impersonate an official credential," she said, her voice now crisp and professional. "Presenting yourself as an authority when you have none is potentially illegal." "Gentlemen," she turned to James. "Mr. Wilson, I owe you an apology on behalf of the HOA. These men have no authority to enforce any regulations, and your property is exempt from most of them anyway under the grandfather clause." "That's what I told them," James said mildly. "Would you like some pot roast? It's quite good, though these gentlemen haven't touched theirs." Mrs. Foster smiled despite the situation. "Perhaps just a little. It does smell wonderful." She set her folder on the counter and took the empty chair next to James, accepting a small plate. Anthony watched the 3 men, noting their increasing discomfort. They reminded him of new recruits caught breaking protocol, a mixture of defiance and fear, unsure whether to double down or confess. "Mrs. Foster," he said, "I'm Anthony Wilson, James's son. Can you explain what actual authority the HOA has regarding enforcement?" She nodded, taking a small bite of pot roast before answering. "The HOA can issue official notices for violations, but only after board approval. Fines can only be levied after multiple notices and a hearing. We certainly don't have enforcement officers or badges." She shot a pointed look at the 3 men. "And these gentlemen?" Anthony pressed. "Have absolutely no authority whatsoever," she stated firmly. "What they've been doing is unauthorized at best and potentially criminal impersonation at worst." Gerald's face had gone from red to white. "We were just trying to maintain standards," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The official process takes too long." "Because it includes due process and fairness," Mrs. Foster replied sharply. "Not intimidation tactics." Robert stared at his untouched plate. "We never actually issued fines," he said quietly. "Just warnings." "Under false pretenses," Mrs. Foster countered. "Wearing uniforms designed to make people believe you had authority you didn't have." Patrick remained silent, his eyes fixed on the toy badge now sitting on the table next to Mrs. Foster's plate. Anthony leaned forward slightly. "How many residents have you approached this way?" The 3 men exchanged glances, none wanting to answer. "I've documented 7 so far," Mrs. Foster said, "based on complaints received, though I suspect there are more. All minorities," James observed quietly. "Interesting coincidence," Gerald's head snapped up. "That's not... We were just enforcing the rules." "Rules that don't apply to my father," Anthony pointed out. "Rules you seem to selectively enforce. And rules you have no authority to enforce in any case," Mrs. Foster added. "The board will need to address this formally." The weight of their situation seemed to finally settle on the 3 men. Their little power play, which had started as petty harassment, had escalated into something with potentially serious consequences. "What happens now?" Robert asked, his voice small. Mrs. Foster considered the question. "That depends partly on Mr. Wilson." If he wishes to file a formal complaint, there could be legal implications. Impersonating officials, harassment, intimidation. Anthony watched his father carefully. In his naval career, he'd learned that how you handled victory was often more important than how you achieved it. His father had always taught him that lesson too, that true strength wasn't about dominating others but about doing what was right, even when you had the upper hand. James set down his fork and looked at the three men who had come to his door intending to bully him. "I don't want to file charges," he said finally. "What I want is for this to stop, not just for me but for everyone in Oak Ridge." Relief flickered across the faces of Gerald, Patrick, and Robert, quickly replaced by wariness. They clearly suspected a trap. "However," James continued, "I do think there needs to be accountability. Mrs. Foster, what would the board recommend?" Mrs. Foster dabbed her mouth with a napkin before answering. "At minimum, a formal apology to everyone they've intimidated, immediate cessation of all unauthorized activities, and resignation from any current HOA committees they serve on." Gerald looked like he might protest, but Anthony's steady gaze silenced him. "I think that's reasonable," James said, "along with a community meeting to clarify actual HOA procedures for everyone. Many of our neighbors might not understand their rights." Anthony nodded approvingly. His father was turning this into an opportunity to help the entire neighborhood, not just punish three misguided men. "I'd be happy to arrange that," Mrs. Foster agreed. "Full transparency would benefit everyone." Patrick finally found his voice. "The board will believe your word over ours," he said bitterly. "This isn't about whose word is believed," Anthony replied. "The evidence speaks for itself. Those uniforms, that badge, the unauthorized notices. The question is what you gentlemen want to do now," Mrs. Foster said. "Continue denying responsibility or start making amends?" Robert was the first to break. "I'm sorry," he said, looking directly at James. "This got out of hand. It started as just, I don't know, feeling like we had some control in the neighborhood, and then it felt good," James finished for him. "Having power over others, making them do what you wanted." Robert nodded shamefacedly. "I've seen that happen in war zones," Anthony said quietly. "How quickly power corrupts when there's no accountability. How easy it is to dehumanize others when you've decided they're somehow less deserving of dignity." Gerald and Patrick remained silent, but something in Anthony's words seemed to reach them. The dining room fell quiet, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. Mrs. Foster broke the silence. "I'll need statements from each of you," she said to the three men, "documenting exactly what you've done and to whom. Then we'll schedule a special board meeting to address this properly." "And if we refuse?" Gerald asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then we proceed with formal complaints and potential legal action," she replied simply. "The choice is yours." The three men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Whatever fantasy of power they'd been living suddenly seemed childish and dangerous in the face of real consequences. "We'll cooperate," Patrick said finally, speaking for the group. James nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now why don't you eat your dinner before it gets cold? No sense wasting good food." The absurdity of the situation, the three men who had come to intimidate him now being offered hospitality, wasn't lost on anyone. But James's simple human decency in the face of their harassment spoke volumes about his character. Anthony watched his father with quiet pride. In the military, he'd learned dozens of tactics for handling confrontation, but his father had just demonstrated the most powerful one of all, maintaining your humanity even when others forget theirs. As the meal continued with awkward small talk, the doorbell rang again. James rose to answer it, returning moments later with a concerned-looking Nancy Chen. "I saw Mrs. Foster's car and got worried," she explained, then stopped short at the sight of the unusual dinner party. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company. Just clearing up a neighborhood misunderstanding," James said smoothly. "Nancy, have you met my son Anthony? He's home on leave from the Navy." As introductions were made, Gerald, Patrick, and Robert exchanged uncomfortable glances. Their enforcement visits had created ripples throughout the community, making neighbors suspicious and fearful of each other. The damage they'd done went beyond specific violations. They'd undermined the trust that made Oak Ridge a community, rather than just a collection of houses. Looking at Nancy, Chen's confused expression, and the determined professionalism of Mrs. Foster, They began to understand the true cost of their actions. The real property value they'd damaged wasn't financial but social. The bonds between neighbors that made a neighborhood worth living in. Anthony observed all of this with the practiced eye of someone who had seen conflict resolution in far more dangerous settings. This wasn't the confrontation any of them had expected when the evening began, but perhaps it was the one they all needed. The Oak Ridge Community Center buzzed with conversation as neighbors filled the rows of chairs. Word had spread quickly about tonight's special meeting, and the turnout was larger than any HOA gathering in recent memory. At the front of the room, a long table was set up with microphones for the board members, with Mrs. Foster seated in the center beside HOA President David Chen. James Wilson sat in the second row, his son Anthony beside him in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable posture of a military officer. Across the room, Gerald, Patrick, and Robert occupied seats near the back, their usual confidence notably absent. The week following the confrontation at James's house had been eventful. True to their reluctant promise, the three men had provided detailed statements about their unauthorized enforcement activities. The list of affected residents had grown to 12 households, all minorities or elderly residents living alone. The pattern was impossible to ignore. David Chen called the meeting to order, his voice firm but calm. Thank you all for coming tonight. We have serious matters to discuss regarding recent events in our community. Mrs. Foster took over, explaining how the fake enforcement committee had operated and what actions the board had taken in response. Murmurs spread through the room as neighbors learned about the scope of the intimidation campaign. Many of you received unauthorized notices or visits from these individuals, she said, gesturing toward the back of the room. To be absolutely clear, these actions were not authorized by the HOA board or management. The men involved had no authority whatsoever. In the audience, Raj Patel raised his hand. When acknowledged, he stood. We repainted our entire house because they told us the color was unauthorized. Cost us over $2,000 we couldn't really afford. Similar stories followed. The Lopez family had removed cherished holiday decorations. The Williams family had torn out a vegetable garden. The elderly Mrs. Johnson had paid a handyman to remove a bench where she used to rest while gardening. Each account added to the tension in the room. Many residents looked toward Gerald, Patrick, and Robert with growing anger. Others appeared confused or betrayed, learning that neighbors they had trusted had abused their confidence. What's going to happen to them? Someone called out. They can't just get away with this. David Chen raised his hands for quiet. The board has considered this matter carefully. The individuals involved have admitted their actions and agreed to make amends. At a nod from the president, Gerald Thompson rose shakily to his feet. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front, taking the microphone with visible discomfort. He began, then paused to clear his throat. What we did was wrong. We had no authority to enforce HOA rules. We targeted specific neighbors unfairly. We intimidated people who had done nothing wrong. The words seemed to physically pain him, but he continued. We're sorry. I'm sorry. Patrick and Robert joined him at the front, each offering similar apologies. The sincerity of their remorse was debatable, but their public admission was itself a form of accountability. Mrs. Foster explained the board's decision. The three men would personally reimburse any expenses incurred by residents due to their fraudulent notices. They were banned from serving on any HOA committees for 5 years. Most significantly, they would perform community service hours helping maintain the neighborhood's common areas, the same kind of visible, physical work they had tried to regulate in others. Some residents grumbled that the punishment wasn't severe enough. Others seemed satisfied with the resolution. The mood in the room remained tense until James Wilson stood up. May I say something? He asked. David Chen nodded, yielding the microphone. James surveyed the room before speaking. I was one of the people targeted by these men, he began. They came to my house to intimidate me about my blue door and basketball hoop. He paused, making eye contact with various neighbors. But this isn't just about three men who overstepped. It's about what kind of community we want to be. The room grew quieter as he continued. I've lived in Oak Ridge for 15 years. Raised my son here. Watched neighbors come and go. This has always been a good place to live, but it could be better. We could know each other better. Look out for each other more. He gestured toward the back of the room. What these men did was wrong, but they're not the only ones who've made others feel unwelcome here. How many of us actually know our neighbors? How many of us have invited someone different from ourselves over for dinner? How many block parties or community events have we organized? Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I'm not excusing what happened, James clarified. But I do think we have an opportunity here to build something better. A community where everyone belongs regardless of what they look like or where they came from. Anthony stood beside his father, his presence adding weight to James's words. In the military, he said when James passed him the microphone, we learn quickly that a unit is only as strong as its weakest relationship. When people don't trust each other, everything falls apart. He looked around the room. I've served with people from every background imaginable. What matters isn't where someone comes from, but whether they have your back when it counts. In Oak Ridge, you all have the chance to have each other's backs, to be a real community, not just people who happen to live on the same streets. As Anthony returned to his seat, Mrs. Foster announced the second purpose of the meeting, new transparency measures for the HOA. Going forward, all residents would receive clear information about HOA rules, including which properties were exempt due to grandfather clauses. All enforcement actions would require documentation and multiple approvals. A new community committee would be formed to foster better relationships between neighbors. We need volunteers for this committee, David Chen said. People committed to bringing Oak Ridge together, not driving it apart. To everyone's surprise, James Wilson raised his hand. I'll serve, he said simply. One by one, other hands went up across the room. The Patels, the Lopez family, Mrs. Johnson, Nancy Chen. Even some residents who had never participated in community activities before. After the meeting, people lingered, talking in small groups. James found himself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to share their experiences or simply introduce themselves properly for the first time. Raj Patel approached with his wife and daughter. That basketball hoop you put up, he said to James. My daughter loves basketball. Would it be okay if she came by sometimes to practice? James smiled. Anytime. That's why I installed it, for the neighborhood kids. Across the room, Anthony observed as Gerald Thompson hesitantly approached his father. The two men spoke quietly for a few moments. James listened more than he talked, nodding occasionally. There was no miraculous friendship forming, but it was a start, a small bridge across a divide that had seemed uncrossable just days before. The following Saturday, James and Anthony hosted the first Oak Ridge block party in 5 years. They set up grills in the driveway, with the controversial basketball hoop serving as a gathering point for neighborhood children. Anthony organized games that required teamwork between kids who had never played together before. Mrs. Johnson brought her famous apple pie. The Patels shared homemade samosas. The Lopez family set up a face painting station for the children. Neighbors who had lived on the same street for years without speaking found themselves deep in conversation. Gerald, Patrick, and Robert showed up hesitantly, carrying sodas and chips as their contribution. They were not welcomed warmly by everyone, but neither were they turned away. The path to redemption would be long and uncertain, but at least they had taken the first step. As evening fell, James sat on his porch with Anthony, watching the neighborhood children play a final basketball game before their parents called them home. You're going to be okay here when I go back? Anthony asked. His leave was ending in 2 weeks, and he worried about leaving his father alone again. James smiled. I think so. Things are changing. Across the street, Nancy Chen waved as she walked by with her husband. The Williams family stopped to chat on their way home, their young son still dribbling a basketball. Raj's daughter made one final perfect shot before reluctantly leaving the hoop. You know, James said, when those men showed up at our door, I was angry, but now I'm almost grateful it happened. Anthony raised an eyebrow. Grateful, really? James nodded. Sometimes it takes a crisis to bring people together, to make them see what was broken all along. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Oak Ridge continued. The community committee organized regular events. Neighbors began to know each other's names, to watch out for each other's homes, to offer help when it was needed. Gerald, Patrick, and Robert fulfilled their obligations, working alongside other volunteers to maintain the community spaces. The relationships were strained at first, but over time, something resembling respect began to develop. Not friendship, perhaps, but the recognition of shared humanity. The blue door on James's house remained, no longer a point of contention, but simply one more detail in the colorful tapestry of the neighborhood. The basketball hoop became a gathering place where children learned to play together, regardless of their differences. And when Anthony returned for his next visit 6 months later, he found his father sitting on the porch with neighbors from across the street, sharing stories and laughter as the evening settled around them. The crisis that had brought them to the brink of division had ultimately led to something unexpected, a genuine community where differences were no longer threats but simply part of what made Oak Ridge home. On his way to greet his father, Anthony passed Gerald Thompson working in the community garden, teaching a group of neighborhood children how to plant tomatoes. Their eyes met briefly, and Gerald nodded in acknowledgement. Not a friend, but no longer an enemy. Some wounds would take longer to heal than others. Some divides would never completely close. But something fundamental had shifted in Oak Ridge, proving that even the worst intentions could sometimes lead to the best outcomes when people chose connection over division, understanding over fear, and community over isolation.